Hi, everybody. Welcome to the panel titled Business Dynamism and Entrepreneurship. This panel is hosted jointly by LMU's Institute for Strategy, Technology, and Organization and NYU's Center for the Future of Management. These joint panels are held semi-regularly, and we'll mention about our next panel at the end of today's panel. Today, we've got two of the most well-known experts on this topic. We have Karen Mills from Harvard and Javier Miranda from IWH Hall. One brief programming note is that we were scheduled to also have Ronnie Chatterji. He's a professor from Duke University who's currently serving in the Biden administration, but he's unable to make it today. Here's the format. We'll start with some brief introductions of each of the panelists. Then we'll jump into a moderated discussion. And after that, we will take audience questions. Audience, you can enter your questions via the Zoom Q&A feature. And again, we'll get to those about partway through the discussion today. And we'll get to as many of those as we can. So I'm going to hand things over to my collaborator here. I'm going to hand things over to Toby Kretschmer.
Thanks very much, Rob. And also very welcome from my side. And so by way of introductions, Karen Mills is a senior fellow at Harvard Business School. She has served in President Barack Obama's cabinet as the administrator of the U.S. Small Business Administration from 2009 until 2013. Karen received the U.S. Department of the Navy's Distinguished Public Services Award for her work on innovation. In addition to her work at Harvard, Karen also serves on a number of corporate and nonprofit boards, including the NBER, National Bureau of Economic Research, and the Harvard Corporation. Karen's interests in terms of research include fintech, innovation policy, and the supply chain economy. Javier Miranda is deputy head of the Department of Structural Change and Productivity at the Halle Institute for Economic Research, IWH. So the IWH, the Halle Institute for Economic Research, is one of 8 publicly funded economic research institutes in Germany. And it serves the goals of the Leibniz Association of Excellence in the Service of Science. So it's been founded in 1992, and IWH's founding missions was to carry out research on the economic transition in East Germany and Central and Eastern Europe. Prior to joining IWH, Javi was principal economist at the US Census Bureau. And Javi's research focuses on entrepreneurship, business dynamism, job creation, and productivity growth. So let's start briefly by defining a couple of terms for our audience. What do we mean by business dynamism, and what do we mean by entrepreneurship? Is that just someone starting a new business? And whoever wants to start of the two of you, feel free. So maybe Karen.
Well, first of all, thank you, Rob and Toby, for having us to discuss this quite critical question. I said I was very excited to get the invitation because it's a place where some new shocks have happened in the system, and we have some little understanding right now of all of the dynamics. And so this is a perfect forum to have the conversation. To level set, I think you ask a critical question, like, why do we even care about dynamism? What is this word about? Is this just, Schumpeter, creative destruction? It feels like it's a good thing if we go out with the old, in with the new. And I think there's some truth to that. I want to make one comment, though, about why dynamism is important in 2 different ways. One is that we know that for driving innovation, having new firm creation has been a key asset in the US innovation economy. And that has really come around some of the technology innovation that we've had. So, we've got our Googles and our Facebook. This has promoted the US economy and our competitive I won't say dominance, but our competitive excellence in some of these sectors because we have this entrepreneurial ecosystem that drives them. But there's a second reason why I think dynamism is important, And that lives in the land of what I'll call Main Street small business. And in that land, new business creation has long been a path to wealth creation and the American dream. So, the story of many in the US, including my family, my grandparents came to this country with nothing, started a business, were able to, create not just a livelihood for their family, but employ hundreds of workers. And that has traditionally been a real asset of the American story of opportunity, which, as we know today, perhaps is not as inclusive, or it's definitely not as inclusive and as open, but still could be enormously important for access and opportunity and wealth creation if we can get it right and reach a more diverse set of entrepreneurs. So those are two reasons why I think we care a lot about dynamism. But Javier, have you been studying this? So you might want to add to this definition.
Well, thank you, Karen. And I am delighted as well to be with all of you. I'm delighted to be with Karen, Rob, and Toby. It's great to be with you, all of you. And this is just such an exciting topic, right? An expanding research field that is just I'm happy to talk about it. So my definition of business dynamism is very much what Karen was hinting at, right? This is the outcome of some entrepreneurial process. So you have lots of firms in the economy. Some of these businesses are going to innovate, introduce some new process, some new product. Businesses that are successful, that innovate successfully, will grow and will displace those that stagnate and lag behind, right? So the outcome of this process is the reallocation of resources from businesses that are less productive, right, to businesses that are more productive. This, of course, leads to productivity growth. So business dynamism is a key component of an outcome of the entrepreneurial process. And it's key in our thinking of productivity growth and raising standards of living in the economy. So a very important component of what happens to our countries is reflected by the patterns that we see in business dynamism over time and in response to shocks, as Karen was mentioning. And then what are entrepreneurs? Of course, entrepreneurs are the agents that are at the heart of this process. And what do entrepreneurs do? Well, they assess the environment and they look for opportunities, right, to innovate in some way. This gets complicated in the ways that Karen very much hinted at, right? There's very different types of entrepreneurs, and they, serve different roles and different functions. But they assess the environment and they introduce or try to introduce some innovations, certainly the ones that have growth intentions and growth potential to generate some profit. So maybe I'll start with that before we get into the details.
Great. So thank you both for those opening remarks and for the definitions. I think definitions is something that we'll probably touch on a few different times over the course of the conversation today. What I want to do next, so I want to move us to start outlining a few facts, if I can call them facts. Let me start by just trying to lay out a few, and then you can react to them and tell me whether I'm right or wrong. And so let me start with what I believe to be one fact. So if you look at firm entry rates, and let me define that, new firm entry rates. So that's number of new firms that are entering the economy each year. And here I mean the US economy. So number of new firms divided by all of the existing firms, right? So that would be a firm entry rate. If you look over the sweep of the past 40 years, firm entry rates have declined, okay? However, if you look maybe over the past 10 years, it looks like firm entry has gone up. And then in particular, over the past 12 to 24 months, there's been a very large spike in new firm formation. Now, I realize that what I've done there is, A, I've talked about sort of the sweep of history, and I've cut history in a few different ways. And then B, I've grouped all new firms together in one category. And I know that the sort of heterogeneity across firms for sure is one of the topics that we want to unpack a little bit. But first, in terms of my description of what I believe to be the facts, long term, there's a decline in firm entry rates. More recently, perhaps it has increased. And then very recently, there's been a spike. Are we in agreement with that? And why don't we start with Karen? Karen gave a thumbs up.
I give you a thumbs up. I think that's what the math shows us. And you're going to ask us, the interesting questions of, do we have the math right? Are we putting the right denominator and numerator together? And you're going to also, I hope, enter into the discussion about what are the causes, why is this spike happening, and how do we feel about these two pieces? But I think you've got the lay of the land.
Javi? And is the lay of the land similar, different in Europe?
So let me get a little bit into, maybe start throwing, right, and getting into some of that heterogeneity. So I'm going to say in general terms, right, so if you look at the economy as a whole, there is a secular trend decline in entrepreneurship in the US. It goes back to the beginning of our time series where we can examine these questions. But certainly there are different patterns displayed in the different sectors. And one important difference is in the high-tech sector, right? This sector that we're talking about that is particularly productive and that it's the source of many jobs in the US. So what's the particular pattern in the high-tech sector? It actually bucked the trend. So actually during the 90s, the high-tech sector actually was growing, right? And there was a lot of firm entry, a lot of entrepreneurs, you think lots of experimentation. So there was at least a decade worth of high growth in this sector. That sharply turned around the 2000s. The high-tech sector in the US now looks very much like the rest of the economy. So very different patterns and important to get into those differences. I'll say another thing in terms of heterogeneity. So there's certainly now fewer firms being started, but there's also fewer of them that become high growth. So there's fewer of them, and fewer of them succeed to generate tons and tons of jobs. So that's a little bit of a problem in the sense that economic activity is highly skewed, right? So there's a few firms that generate tons of jobs, and that's where we seem to be having a gap now. Of course, this has tons of implications, right? I've already mentioned high growth firms and their role in productivity and job creation. So this is tied to our ability to innovate, right? Growing standards of living, creating jobs and new industries that are innovative, even just our ability to respond to economic crisis, right? But there's lots of discussion, by the way, as to how we measure high growth firms. And there's if you go to talk to people in Silicon Valley, they tell you, there's no such decline. So there's lots of growth there, lots of energy. So there's certainly some tension there that we can get into, right? One final point in terms of just throwing some ideas before we dig into it. It's not just entrepreneurship that is declining. All businesses in general seem to be slowing down. So entrepreneurship is down, but the way businesses respond to shocks is also slowing down. Maybe there's the same underlying reasons for both things, but it's important to recognize, I think, that there's a general slowdown in the economic environment. I'll stop there.
If I could add a little bit, following Javier, what you just said, these are really interesting and important trends underlying this decline? Do we think a decline is a negative? It could be that the math just says to us that fewer small and early stage firms die, and they don't die as quickly, or they might last longer. So coming underneath that is important. And I want to maybe take this moment to lay out the heterogeneity question. And Rob, maybe it's worth putting up a categorization slide. As Javier said, it's very difficult to find out how many high growth firms there are. We did some work on trying to categorize the small business economy. And this was done with Mercedes Delgado on the supply chain work we did. But we were able to actually look at the 32 million US small businesses. We all know that most of them are non-employer firms. 26 million of the 32 million are non-employer firms. And the employer firms, and so that's a really important category we're going to talk to, because it turns out maybe some of the spike we're going to see are people who were, decided they were going to leave the workforce in COVID and start their own business. The number of high growth firms, as near as we can tell, is somewhere in the 200,000 range. And by that, we are looking at firms which are venture capital backed, which tend to exhibit the sort of high growth that we see in, the technology area. But once again, it's very hard to measure that category. We have measured, though, two other categories. One is Main Street firms, which are generally consumer facing. And this is your traditional cafe or dry cleaner. And supplier firms, which are part of the supply chain. There's about 1 million supplier firms. So keeping this in mind, and this is what we usually think about as, your traditional parts supplier. Each one of these requires a different policy set of activities to make them grow, to increase their well-being, longevity, access to capital. And so it's important to just see how many of each firms they are, because we will be talking about each one of them as a slightly different piece of the economy, which requires slightly different policy levers. Maybe I'll leave it at that, and we can kind of come back to your questions.
One thing that I maybe add, not so much a response to Karen, who is exactly right about her description of these categories. Just want to bring back one of your questions that I didn't quite answer, which is what's happening in Europe, right? And so I've been looking at Europe quite a bit lately. I'm spending quite a bit of time in Europe now. As you said, I moved here about a year ago. And so we're starting to dig into the European data, and it's striking to see that the decline, and some of this we already knew, by the way. So great work that the OECD is doing on this. So there's a clear decline in dynamism in Europe across European economies. One thing that we're starting to see is that there's a decline in high growth firm activity as well. And some of the declines that we're seeing, they're similar in magnitude, I'm going to say, to the declines that we see here in Europe. But in some of these economies where we think the traditional think that entrepreneurship is not important, I'm thinking specifically about Germany. We're seeing huge declines in high growth firm activity and very large declines in entrepreneurship as well.
Great. So, Javi, you've mentioned decline a few times in your last mention. So, maybe we can kind of draw an arc to one of the previous panels, or the last panel we actually had, which was on superstar firms, and there. our last speakers, Tommaso Valetti and John Van Reenen, talked, among other things, about barriers to entry that will allow these superstar firms to grow at the expense of other firms, including some of the entrants. Is that something you would consider a cause for that decline that we're seeing, or is there other stuff going on?
Yeah, so there's lots going on, but I think superstar firms and the growth of superstar firms really does provide clues to understand what's happening, and certainly to understand what's happening to this critical segment of high growth innovative firms, right? And I'm going to say I don't think there's consensus as to what's happening, right? I don't think there's one single explanation. I don't think there's consensus about what's driving the growth and the dominance of some of these superstar firms. I'm just going to say that explanations, I think, hinge around notions of frictions or wedges that are preventing firms from attaining what we as economists might think of as a perfect equilibrium optimum, right? And these are frictions and wedges that we think benefit large firms to the detriment of young entrepreneurial firms. And these frictions can act in different markets, I'm gonna say. So we often think about frictions in labor markets. And so how do we think about this, right? If it's increasingly costly for firms to hire or shed workers, or for workers to find other jobs, or to create a new business, this is going to lead directly to a decline in reallocation. Firms are not going to achieve their optimal size, and fewer firms are going to be reallocated, created. So in this framework, it's possible to think about government regulations that are benefiting large firms relative to entrepreneurial firms. What are some of these things? The growth in the use of non-compete agreements, we can talk about that. Licensing and regulation has changed dramatically over time. These types of regulatory environment and regulations can give large firms power, specifically in labor markets. There's also frictions and wedges that might appear in product markets, right? And this is where superstar firms are important, right? So these are firms that are highly, highly innovative. They're very efficient. They produce at low cost. They're offering new products and services. And of course, in the process, they're going to get larger, right? And they're going to get market share. This is good in principle. And this is going to lead to allocative efficiency and productivity growth, the things that I was talking about earlier. So this, in principle, it's all good. The problem is when these firms get too large, and they might get too large, and they may get to a point where they exploit their technological advantage and their market dominance to grab market share and extract rents, right? Not passing lower prices to consumers. So there's a little bit of tension there. With these firms being highly productive, that's good, but they can get to the point where they're too large and they're twisting their muscle, if you will. Key to this, of course, is the nature of these firms and the nature of the technologies and the innovations that they're bringing in that might generate frictions in the innovation process itself. And this is something that we are worrying a lot about because it hints at a problem with the diffusion of knowledge and our ability to really continue to innovate and reap the benefits from that. What's the story here? So initially, you have lots of firms, they're innovating, they're competing for technological supremacy. There are strong incentives for businesses and entrepreneurs to come in, right? Compete with each other to try to win the pie, right? Be the dominant player. Now, a natural consequence of all of this is that some firms are going to take the lead, right? Some startups are going to develop, and they're going to leap ahead. this can lead to a reversal of incentives. It might be that entrepreneurs find it increasingly hard to compete with these highly productive firms. Those entrepreneurs can lose hope. Right? We think about hope. Karen, working in the Obama administration, these smaller firms, it's new entrepreneurs, can lose hope when these firms get so big and leapfrog so far ahead. Importantly, when the competition environment declines, right, this can have negative incentives for these superstar firms to continue innovating, right? And so, so there's a little bit of tension here. To summarize, I think my thoughts on superstar firms. Their growth can lead to a decline in knowledge diffusion. They can abuse their position through patent thickets. There might be issues with weaker antitrust law. These technologies, which can exacerbate the problem, right? These technologies and these firms are often in digital sectors or use these digital technologies. This generates network effects that reinforces these types of problems. There's VC, right? Financing. Karen is an expert on all of this. That might be driving some of the issues. And of course, there's the whole thing, by the way, which is a completely different angle on the decline of the current technological revolution, right? And so you have techno-optimists and techno-pessimists battling it out as to whether that is part of what's driving that decline.
Javi, thank you for that. Let's give Karen the mic back to Karen, as it were, just to see if she wants to respond to any of the points that you raised.
Well, I'd love to build on these examples that Javier talked about with two industries that are not big tech. Because I think the superstar firm thing is quite interesting in big tech, but it also plays out in some other industries in conflicting ways. So one example is fintech, where you've got lots and lots of big banks, and you would think they would have competitive advantage because they have the ability to get low-cost deposits and they have the ability to have all these customers. But you see a whole growth and innovation in fintech. So what is the role of regulation in this case? And here is where I think regulators have to be much smarter than they have before, because the argument used to be more regulation or less regulation. And that, I think, is a false choice. When you come into a new world where you've got data aggregation, you have to do what I call smart regulation. And you have to think about what is the regulatory play that will open the playing field, that will create more innovation, but still keep everybody's financial assets safe and secure. So regulators have a big role to play. And I would contend that, having data ownership be in the hands of those people who create the data. So you own your own bank account, something like open banking, is quite important to innovation and competition rather than, breaking up banks. Banks are feeling competitive or protecting banks. And I think we can take another industry. If we look at our large firms hurting entry and dynamism on a completely different end of the scale, one of the things we see in the numbers, Rob, that you pointed out, is that lots and lots of dynamism was lost during the era of big box stores. It used to be that lots of these new entrants were your local grocery store, your local hardware store, and your local drugstore. And in the US, and really, I think across many places, this has been taken over by Home Depot and CVS and large players who have given us low pricing and have given us a lot of benefits. But if you go down Main Street now, you don't see those entrepreneurial startups and those family businesses. So it's not clear that we want to change our policy. and that we don't get lots of benefits from these large players, but we have to recognize that we need to open up more paths to entrepreneurship. Just one thing on the bright side is that we do see innovation coming in because people are getting tired of eating just at Applebee's and the chain restaurants. So we have seen, particularly in COVID, a reflourishing of retail, even to the extent of shop small and, retail gifts, all of which you used to buy on Amazon or from a large player in a mall. That has gone away. So I am hopeful that some of those trends are turning around just because the consumer craves innovation and dynamism. So on the retail side and on the restaurant side and on some of these small business opportunities, we are actually seeing some positive indications that there will be dynamism that just comes from the entrepreneurial nature of the providers and the wish for diverse, options from the consumer.
Karen, thank you for raising that. I want to come back in just a moment to sort of some of the more recent trends that you just touched on. So I'll do that in just a moment. Before I do that, I just want to remind the audience that if you have questions, please use the Zoom Q&A feature to put your questions in, and we'll get to as many of these as we can. So we'll turn to those in just a moment. But I want to come back to something that Karen brought up a moment ago, which was, Karen, you mentioned about very recent trends, and in particular, you highlighted trends sort of during and coming out of COVID. So if you want, I can go ahead and share the one of the next slides that you have, and it'd be great if you could let all of us know about what's going on there.
Well, economists love a shock. And for COVID, we got some great shocks. But in one of the most mystifying results, we have seen business applications go skyrocketing up. That spike is 80%. And the leveling out is, 30, 40, 50%, depending on which numbers you take. So what has happened is that entrepreneurs are filing new business applications at an extraordinary rate starting the first quarter into COVID. That's July in 2020. And then with some blips, continuing at this accelerated pace. And I guess we've looked at all the work that we can find on this. And I think the short answer is nobody can really figure this out. There is something quite bizarre happening. At the beginning, we thought people are just applying to get EIN numbers so they can get PPP. We just don't know. And that has sort of proven not to be the case. So we have a major reshuffling of our entrepreneurial activity from this shock. And anybody who is working on this, I hope you might put in a comment or question so we can hear more about what might be happening. If you just show one more chart, the question is, are people applying or are they actually forming businesses? And so there are business formation statistics. This is monthly business formations from the applications within 8 quarters. Now, the caveat on this is that the last set is not real data. It's just projected data. So we don't 100% know that this higher elevated level is continuing in business formations. But what some recent work showed is that most of these applications are turning, a very large number, not most, but a very large number are turning into businesses. And they are not only turning into businesses, but they're turning into a category that they call firms most likely to hire employees. So many are sole proprietors, but a surprising number are turning into firms likely to hire employees. So we have a very interesting shock and a very interesting elevated level. And I think we are mystified, honestly, and would love more work in this area to find out why. We have some hypotheses about disruption in the labor markets, but no deep analysis yet.
Karen, just as a follow-up, so we've gotten a couple of questions from Susan Perkins, sent in some questions specifically around the COVID spikes. And the first question was, do you know whether those are non-employer versus employer firms? And I think you started to answer that it sounds like it's mostly non-employer, although they're starting to transition into employer. That was the first question. And then the second was whether there are any breakouts by race and gender. And Susan says, I would expect the percent among women would be higher in and after COVID.
Well, Susan, that's one of the hypotheses, is that there's a very high percentage of these in women and minority-owned businesses. People who have just said, you know what, it's time for me to start my own. The couple of papers that have looked at this, John Houtenwanger has one from, it's about a year ago, June 2021. And then there's one from January, which is just from the Economic Innovation Group, that just talks about some of the data that exists. We don't know, we don't have data on race. And that is one of my pet peeves, to be honest with you, which is that we don't collect that data, despite the fact that in Dodd-Frank, Section 1071 requires, the law requires the CFPB to begin collecting that data 10 years ago. We still don't have it, so we need it to answer these questions. But the answer on sole proprietorships was a surprise, in that in this category that they measure of firms most likely to hire employees, that tends to be a substantial number of these formations. So I would say we don't have the exact data yet, but we have some indication that it is not only sole proprietors.
Fantastic, Karen. Thank you very much. I'd like to turn over to Javi. The two of us are sticking up for the old world, and Europe and Germany in particular. So, Javi, do we see that same spike in Germany or in Europe too? And if not, why not?
Yeah, so there's some data. So there's some data and a nice paper that the Bank of England has using very similar data. They show very similar patterns, remarkably similar. I'm going to say I'm not as puzzled by what we see in the data, right? The COVID shock was a huge shock. And indeed, as Karen mentioned, and the person in the audience asked, a lot of these are non-employers, right? People that lost their jobs. Of course, they're going to try to create a job. I think about most of these as subsistence businesses, and most of these will not turn into anything, right? At all. But Karen is right. Some of these are turning into new businesses. A lot of these are in online retail, which you can expect, right? Retail sector received a huge shock, and businesses and individuals, entrepreneurs, are going to try to develop businesses online, right? There's a lot in accommodation. Now, something that we do know from the work out of the Bank of England is that these businesses do not last very long. They don't seem to last very long at all. And so they do create jobs, a few of them, but these jobs don't seem to be lasting a long time. So now Karen is also right that this might be spurring a whole new set of technologies, right? I think we don't know yet what's happening. We don't know how many jobs are going to be created, and we don't know how long they're going to last. I'm not terribly optimistic. They seems to suggest that there's some restructuring happening in some of these sectors, and certainly entrepreneurs, as they will do, are experimenting right, with these technologies, and maybe there'll be important innovations that come out of it. But I'm not necessarily, reading too much into these things yet.
Cool, thanks, Javi. And I'd like to pick up on some of the points that you made, and kind of segue into a question by Steffen Müller, who has asked, you nicely explained the benefits of entrepreneurship for growth and innovation. So that kind of what you just discussed at the tail end of your answer. I wonder how sure we are about that. I think there are countries like Germany that are very innovative without having a lot of entrepreneurship. Is this a matter of institutions, and are there varieties of capitalism, some relying on entrepreneurs while others do not?
Yeah, this is a great question. And of course, Stefan and I have conversations about this all the time. And I think this is an open question, right? I don't think that we know. And Germany, certainly since I've arrived here, I keep hearing it's a special case, and it might be different. I know two things, and so for sure, the institutional environment matters, the laws and regulations matter, training matters, all these things matter. I'll maybe say two things. Productivity growth, which is kind of right what I've been trying to talk, and why I think entrepreneurship is so important. Productivity growth is declining also in Germany. The other thing that I'll say, Germany, I said it before. I hear there's a lot of research to be done. The data in Germany needs to be developed. There's lots of work to be done. But I do hear this idea of these large corporations, right? No need for entrepreneurs. Of course, in the US, we have lots, huge corporations, but also lots of entrepreneurs, right? But to this point that Germany is different, I'll say in the data, we're seeing Germany had a lot of high growth firms, and they don't seem to have them anymore. So one, I question whether indeed Germany is that different or was that different. And again, and whether we can, and whether it's true that these firms, these large corporations in Germany, are so innovative, and can remain as innovative. And one last thing I'll say, Tesla didn't rise out of Germany; it rose out of an entrepreneur, a highly innovative individual in the US. So I think Stefan is right that there's lots of questions that we need to figure out about whether the basic function of an entrepreneur, which is an innovator, right, can be done inside a large corporation. This is a key question that people have had for a long time. I don't think we know that large businesses can succeed the way entrepreneurs have demonstrated they can.
Javi, thank you. The direction the conversation is going right now, we're starting to talk about institutional differences across the U.S. and Germany. And of course, there's a variety of institutional differences. Some of them are policy and regulatory differences. And so I think it's a natural segue now to shift to talking about policy, because we want to make sure that we cover policy as well. So the next question we'll start with Karen, and then Javi, come to you next, is to ask about policies that can help address declining dynamism, to the extent that we think that declining dynamism is an issue, or just more generally policies that we think are useful and supportive of entrepreneurs. And so, Karen, we want to start with you, and I guess I'd first invite you, to the extent that you can or want to, discuss any of the policy work that you did for the Obama administration. To the extent that that's germane, it'd be great to hear about that. And then in general, just hear your take on policies that can be helpful in this space.
Well, I'll say a couple things about the 2009 crisis for a second, and then turn to this question of general policy differences. And then at that moment, maybe we'll put up a grid that, was inspired by the years I had in Washington. In 2009, we know that we had a severe financial contraction and crisis, And at that moment, small business and entrepreneurship really ground to a halt. In running the SBA, we did some things around access to capital that were quite bold at the time. I think if I wasn't a venture capitalist, I never would have had the guts to jump up and down in the White House and sort of scream about. But we raised the guarantee rates on SBA loans to 90%. And I call it the hockey stick that did happen because we got, we did $30 billion of SBA guarantees. And that was because the capital markets had just frozen. All the banks had too many bad mortgages on their books. They stopped lending to small businesses. So we know when you take institutional capital out of the system, you get a real crushing effect on this dynamism. And you see in your charts at 2009, new business starts just grind to a halt, and they're very, very slow to recover, which is one reason why I'm so excited but mystified by the very different response in this very different crisis. But sort of level setting for when the world is normal, there really are a whole set of policies that you can do to promote entrepreneurship. And around the world, I've been talking and listening to the way different nations do these, and they fall into these two categories. And the important thing to remember is all the things we do for high growth firms, most of those things are very different from what we do across the world for Main Street businesses. And the three areas that I just want to briefly mention, you can bucket the kinds of policies into access to capital, counseling and advice, for which there is insatiable demand for small business advice and counsel, and a third, which I'll call ecosystems. And I'll just give you a couple examples. In the high growth firms, we have lots and lots and lots of policies around creating access to capital, angel credits, SBIR. Things in the UK, they have been very good about scale-up capital, which we are trying to do more of. The number of grants and business plan competitions in all areas has just skyrocketed, including one at Harvard Business School for Black business owners that has been hugely successful. So there's room for lots and lots of innovation in these programs. There's also different startup academies and Y Combinator and ecosystems around accelerators that are just built for high growth businesses. These programs tend to live in different government agencies from Main Street small businesses. And one of my pet peeves when I talk to folks is that they conflate, I'm working for a small business, and then they'll tell me about a high growth capital startup angel tax credit. What you have to really decide at the beginning who you are serving and then construct your program to serve them, or you end up with a confused and sometimes not a successful program. But on Main Street, which is the bulk of the actual businesses, are Main Street startups. And they're the kinds of things like SBA's guarantee program, different kinds of tax policy that benefits a startup, all the advising that you might find in SCORE advisors, small business development centers, and all of the associations you might see on Main Street, all of the activity around Small Business Saturday, which promotes local shop small activity. Those kinds of things have proven to be really powerful. So you can construct a portfolio of these two different things, and it's not either or. As I said in the beginning, it's both and, because you need an innovation driver for the productivity that Javier talked about, but you also need job creation in Main Street. And I'll just leave you with one number, which is, they used to say in the White House, half the people who work in this country own or work for a small business. So that's half of America's jobs. And once again, it's been the path to wealth creation. And I think it is the path which we are going to use to create more access and opportunity if we get it right in terms of doing all these things for Black-owned small businesses, women-owned small businesses, underserved areas, rural areas. We can target these policies and make a real difference.
Thank you, Karen. I'm going to stop sharing at least for a moment. And then Javier, wanted to turn it back to you, A, to see if you wanted to react to anything that Karen said, and then B, given all of the research that you've done on business dynamism and small businesses and entrepreneurship, just hear anything from your point of view about policies that work particularly well.
Yeah, for sure. First of all, I want to say and recognize Karen's Karen. So I met Karen years ago when she was indeed the administrator of the Small Business Administration. And we had lots of conversations, not that many because Karen was very busy, but Karen really started recognizing, right, the need to distinguish policies, right, and how we target these very different types of populations, right? What I think, what Karen calls mainstream business versus high growth businesses. So my hat, for so many years work to really drill this idea, right? The other thing I'll say also is, we have to be. You mentioned, Rob, what are the policies to reduce declining dynamism? And I'm going to say, I'm going to push a little bit of some of what Karen has said, although I agree fully with what she said. But we have to be very careful, supporting businesses that are not productive, right? Businesses that don't add value to the economy, because by doing that, we're locking those resources that could otherwise go to businesses that are more productive. So locking people in jobs that are not generating value to the economy is not a good policy, right? And so I think we need to be very clear about that. So earlier we talked about declining dynamism in the retail sector with mom and pop stores and the big box. Well, that declining dynamism in that specific sector was highly productive, right? And Karen explained the reasons why. Do we want to stop that? Would we have wanted to stop that? Right? This was a sector that was dominated by small mom and pop shops, not very long lasting, very volatile, right? Not necessarily good wages. So we have to be a little bit careful when we think about how we target these policies. The other thing I'll say, and this goes back to the to these firms that are these high growth firms, right? And the decline in this particular segment of highly innovative firms. If we think that what's happening is that these superstar firms are discouraging innovation, right? And by the way, there's evidence that the innovations coming out of these firms are not very radical at all, right? They're increasingly incremental innovations, if you will. So if we want to reignite the innovation and dynamism, we have to give hope back to entrepreneurs, and we have to give them hope that they can compete, right, with these big corporations, especially if they're using their power to stifle the competition. So what are some of the things that we can do? Karen mentioned VC and funding. I think funding is critical. Funding in basic science, right? Giving a kick up or supporting future entrepreneurs based on new technologies and new innovation, so that they can leapfrog ahead of these big corporations. I think that's important. Of course, SBIR type programs that support new technologies and entrepreneurs, I think is very important. And then, of course, when it comes to preventing competition, right, through non-compete agreements, of course, the Biden administration has passed an executive order to draft rules that limit this practice, right, and allow for workers to move around and maybe start new firms. So, so that's a few ideas there.
Go ahead, Toby.
Go ahead, Rob.
Okay. So first, just wanted to ask Karen if she had any reactions to what Javi said, since Javi, of course, prefaced what he was saying with, I want to push back a little bit.
Yes. Well, Javier just described one of the real tension points about this whole question about dynamism, which is, do you even care about the second piece of the dynamism that I described as, one of the powerful motivators? And most macroeconomists say, no, we don't care. Because if you look at what's driving the economy, productivity, if you look at C plus I plus G, well, there's the consumer. We care about that. There's investment. Well, that's just big business. And there's government spending. And what I described from small business, Main Street small business, doesn't show up in that equation. And my pushback to the macroeconomists, who are perfectly correct in their models, is yes, but half the people who work in this country own or work for small business. Traditionally, this is the path to economic mobility. We have entrepreneurship as sort of an asset of the United States. People come here knowing they can start a business, fail, start another business. We are the envy with our entrepreneurship model. Do we really not care about any of that because it's not in your model? And I would submit that, in the experience of driving an inclusive economic growth, you have to have both growth and shared prosperity, and that the shared prosperity piece relies greatly in this country on the ability to start and maintain a small business, because that is a big piece of our jobs engine in this. I also ask people to do a thought experiment, which is, imagine that there are no small businesses at all, and that every time you went to a lawyer, he was part of a big firm, or she was part of a big firm, or a doctor was part of a big health organization. And in Main Street, there was only chain restaurants. How would you feel about your community and your activity? And most people get very riled up. They get very anxious about a world with no small businesses. So I just think that that although it doesn't show up, that this second reason why we care about dynamism is as powerful as the first.
Thanks, Karen. I think that's a fantastic closing argument. I am actually about to go for dinner in a small French restaurant, so I'm very glad this is not a chain. But thank you very much, Karen and Javi. Thank you very much to everyone who has joined this program and for your questions. So the next event in our speaker series is going to be on Thursday, November the 17th at 12 p.m. Eastern or 6 p.m. Central European Time, when we're going to welcome Jim Besson from Boston University, who will discuss his new book, The No Goliaths: How Corporations Use Software to Dominate Industries, Kill Innovation, and Undermine Regulation. That's going to be published by Yale University Press. Thank you very much to everyone, and goodbye.